I will be sharing some works of a special phase in Indian architecture, which is sort of the second generation of modernists, if I may say. And this was a period where there was a lot of socially relevant phase of the Indian architecture from the 70s roughly to the 90s. And there was a search for meaning, and architects were trying to also respond to the Indian condition, both seeking sort of the, looking at the older heritage, what was tradition, trying to find patterns, but it was still very modernist phase. So I'm not really a sort of architectural historian, but I was a student during that era in the early 80s, and many of the architects of that generation have had a seminal influence on architects of my generation, who are including even now currently their teachers. So I think with that sort of introduction, I proceed with the lecture.
Yes, please.
So let me just...
if you don't mind to share your screen.
Yes. Just... Okay, I seem to have lost something there.
Yes, now your screen is visible.
Visible?
Yes.
And, okay. And you can see full screen?
Yes.
Yes. All right. So this is Indian architecture and the search for identity, responses to climate, tradition, and economics. Because as we will see, economics was also a very important part of the early phase. Even it currently is a very important aspect of architecture in India. I'll just give you a very quick introduction if people are not familiar, or most would be familiar, but just to orient ourselves. India is really the Indian subcontinent. Politically, there may be different boundaries, but geographically, it's a subcontinent, and it's predominantly a hot climate. The tip, Cape Comorin, is at about 8 degrees north, and it extends up to 37 degrees north. So most of the mainland lies within the tropics. There is very varied kind of climate there as well. So the traditional architecture has been very rich, and there have been very traditional different responses to the climate. Also, although politically the boundaries are different, culturally the subcontinent has similar roots and a common history. And prior to what is currently India, for about 200 years, it was a British colony. And so that had its own period of architecture, and there was a lot of influence that came into during the colonial period. And historically, it has of course been very rich in arts and architecture. Here we can see right from the Indus Valley civilization, we had Mohenjo-daro, we have temple architecture of different regions, that is Khajuraho here. We have the Hawa Mahal. These are just some examples. As any culture, it was very, very rich in architecture. Just a quick run through to get an idea of the sort of vast spectrum of architectural responses which existed in India before the British came in. We had responses to hot, humid climate, and the rainy climates from Assam, from Kerala, from Goa. Goa was, of course, influenced by the Portuguese. That's the Portuguese house. We had cold desert climates up in Ladakh, abutting Tibet. Also mountainous, cold mountainous climates. And that was the traditional architecture prevailing. And when the British came in, their major focus was on creating infrastructure, because as a colony, they were taking resources from India, and most of the raw materials was going to Britain, to places like Manchester. Cotton was all carried there, and produce, cloth, fabric, different products were made and brought back into India. So infrastructure was important for movement of raw materials, and most of the architecture focused on cantonments, barracks, engineering projects, but also a lot of public buildings were made. This image here is the Viceregal Lodge in Simla, which is up in the mountains. It was a summer capital for the British. So we gained a lot in terms of infrastructure, and also the traditional construction materials were replaced by the British brick, which is a different size from our traditional brick. There was also patent roofs. Steel began to be used to create large spans. These are just some images from the British, typical colonial bungalow you see on the right. And then we have our Capitol complex, which was completed in 1933, a short while before our independence, designed by Sir Edwin Lutyens. So for a lot of the architecture, there were foreign architects who were used during the British period, and they also had a large public works department. And initially, a College of Architecture came up in Mumbai, where Bartlett trained a number of people, because architects were needed to carry on these works. And during the later time, the British even sponsored Habib Rahman and Kanwinde to go overseas and study architecture. And I think they went to MIT, Kanwinde went to Harvard, and Habib Rahman trained at MIT. Both of them were taught by Walter Gropius. And Mansingh Rana went and worked with I will just tell you a short while. Okay, so that is the kind of British legacy and from there we come to the period after independence. So when India got independent, there was not much financial wherewithal, and India was it still is, largely a very rural society. There was large socioeconomic disparities, technically called a third world nation. There was a scarcity of goods at that time. We got our independence in 1947. So, 47, 1950, that's the era I'm talking about. Construction materials, also steel and cement, were very, very expensive. So due to this, in fact, a lot of construction in the Indian subcontinent has been more focused on masonry and concrete and RCC, very little of steel construction even today, because steel was always more expensive than concrete. Now, another aspect that also was very typical for India was that at independence was that we had the partition of India, and there was a mass exodus of about 17 million displaced people who came in, and they just came into the cities and they were put up in encampments. There was also, since there was not much development in rural areas, there was a lot of rural to urban migration as well in search of livelihood and better facilities. So there has been a lot of pressure on housing. And the projects we are going to be looking at are also projects which really address the housing needs. So our first Prime Minister, and who continued for many terms, PM Nehru, was a visionary. He had an understanding of architecture, and he felt that it is important that India begins with a very clean slate and there is some new thinking for a new nation. And he, in fact, he is the one who invited foreign architects to come and design in India, including Corbusier, who then finally did the Chandigarh Capitol complex. And Nehru also sort of mooted at a conference that there should be a national style of architecture. This was a conference about architecture, and thankfully it was summarily rejected by architects that you cannot have one national style in such a diverse country. And this is the same generation of architects who went on to create a very, very responsive architecture. And I quote here from, this is Korea, from Charles Korea, that there is a great lyricism in the Indian temperament, in the songs, in the poetry, the lyrical meanings, the ability to sing, to make continuous patterns around a theme. Perhaps Indian architecture, like Mozart, perhaps Indian architecture will be like Mozart, a great lyricism, and in this center, a clear, concise idea, as clean and hard as a theorem. The house around the courtyard, the clear statement, the tree, the shadows, the texture, providing rhythm and patterns and counterpoint. So I shared this just for you to get an idea what was in the mind and how the architects at that time thought and envisaged architecture. So the post-independence period, and I take this distinction from a seminal book by Peter Scriver and Vikram Bhatt, who described the early phase of Indian architecture as the masters, and after that they say after the masters. The masters namely being Corbusier and Louis Kahn, both of whom built projects in India, and many Indian architects were greatly influenced, and Chandigarh was a mecca, so to say, for Indian architects. And why Nehru wanted this sort of very modernist structure in India is that he believed that there should be a new energy and there should be free thinking, and we should really begin on a clean canvas. And he said, you may squirm at the impact, but it has made you think and imbibe new ideas. And one thing which India requires is being hit on the head so that it may think. That's because there had been years of no space to think because of the colonial rule. You just had to follow whatever was mandated. Here, this is the IIM, Indian Institute of Management, by Louis Kahn. This is in Ahmedabad. So that period onwards, it was a time of nation building. Lots of new townships and cities were built, especially many industrial townships. There was also institution building, lots of the Institute of Management, medical colleges, the Indian Institutes of Technology, to create engineers, doctors, architects, managers, economists. And during this early phase, architects, as I mentioned earlier, Habib Rahman, Man Singh Rana, and Kanvinde, who had been educated and worked overseas and were highly influenced by the modern movement. Their work was prevalent. We see here, this is a work by Kanvinde, one of his early works. So we can see the very, very modernist house in Ahmedabad. This is Balkrishan Hari Vallabh Das house. This is architect Habib Rahman. He studied at MIT, very influenced by Gropius. This is the World Health Organization building in New Delhi. Okay, so this was sort of the early phase, and subsequently around the late 70s, architects began to really search for more relevant and meaningful architecture and trying to see how they could respond to what is Indian, or even to define what is this Indian. Yes, and there was a marked effort to, move away from that idiom and search for relevant Indian architecture to respond to the environment, the cultural milieu, and also looking at, many people looked at the craft tradition, the ability to work with the hand. They looked at the tradition, design, and patterns, and traditional architecture. Also, they were addressing the constraints of available materials, resources, and technology, or just the economic condition that was India. It was also a sort of era of idealism, and during that, a generation of architects emerged, who I again quote Scriver and Hutt here. These architects designed with a belief system and who were trying through their own work to question the then established way of doing architecture. And these thinking architects ran offices that were committed practices, were the ones that were greater in number, while only a handful of large firms ran commercial offices. So we will be looking at the work of a few of these architects, not all of them, and their response in terms of housing design. But first we look at a few images from different traditional architecture in cities. So this is a street from Ahmedabad, typically as designed for hot climate. You can see the narrow streets, shaded alleyways, and the very dense form of development, very private. This is a street from Old Delhi, Chandni Chowk. Here again, you see the interface of the house with the street. The streets were called gullies. So there is very rich embellishment. You can also see the sort of transition from the street into the house. It is graded. We can note some platforms there. These are very typical in urban and also rural areas, even in the villages. That's typically a house or a haveli would then, you would walk into a courtyard, and the whole sort of building morphology was built around a courtyard. This is from Jaisalmer. Many architects went and studied, all of this generation of architects went and studied these, did measure drawings, recorded and documented these places, and tried to see how life existed here. This is a very famous haveli in Jaisalmer called Patun Ki Haveli. And you can see again the very rich architectural response here. It's built with the local stone. Again, the entrance has space to sit and interface with the street, and a lot of jalis or fretwork on the windows, which allows the breeze to pass through while maintaining privacy in this kind of very dense development. And also we see the terrace. The terrace was an important part of living, just as the outside street was public. The terrace was an important part of living, with a lot of sleeping activity happening outdoors. This is the internal courtyard of the same Patmoti Haveli, and you again see the internal courtyards are narrow, capturing the cool air. So shadows and light and shade and creating shadows was an important aspect of that, of the traditional architecture in the predominantly hot areas of the central mainlands. This is a part plan of one of the regions, again from Jaisalmer. And here we can see the different scales of the streets, the very, very dense development, very narrow streets, and again, a sort of rhythm where the streets open out onto larger spaces. And there is a hierarchy of spaces. The streets may move around. There may be a somewhat public function, and there are pauses, so to say, and these will typically be places where people may gather. And then there will be a larger community space, or they are called chowk in our traditional language. And these are also similar there. I mean, such developments are there across the world, especially all countries which have a hot climate. The vernacular structures are similar, the pattern of development. Here we have a bird's eye view of Jaisalmer. So you can see the shaded streets, the dense development, and the large amount of terracing at different levels. And if you look carefully, we can see how the terrace is also outdoor living space. In summers, in the afternoon, they came out for summer sun. In winter, they came for the afternoon sun. And in summer, these were sleeping areas, cool and breezy. This is Datia Palace. And again, this has some very interesting stepping and stepped terraces at different levels. Sharing because that was also a popular vocabulary in the sort of 80s, 70s, and 80s architecture. Here again, we see the city of Jodhpur, very similar pattern of development with the narrow streets opening into larger communal spaces and then into the next larger space, so kind of veritable labyrinth, but very rich in social interaction. And of course, all of these older developments in traditional cities initially were all pedestrian. So one of the challenges of the modernist was also how do you address vehicles if you are trying to deal with traditional architecture, inspire from there. This is what a typical, this is from rural India, rural Haryana. This would be recent. People still live like that. There will be a large chalk, a large tree, and there will be community interaction. People can come and sit there, and activities begin to happen around such focal points. As you can see, in one side, there is a fruit seller. There's a group of men, some old ladies. Some shops also come up around that region, and all these are, organic. They happen on their own. This is another chalk. This is from Maharashtra, so the other side of India. You see here in the foreground a well. That's the village well. There is again a large shady tree under which a whole lot of activities. Market has come up. And you can see the sort of narrow lanes going off into the other side. This is from a village in the desert. And another aspect that these architects looked at was, especially Charles Correa had talked of spaces that even the under the sky is also an open space. Here you can see this is the house. It's very private, but there is a large courtyard, and that is the open to sky space that he also has tried to capture in his work. Yeah, so here on the top we see this lady, she's cooking outside. It still happens in India. A lot of life is still very much like this. And this is part of that internal private courtyard, which is a sort of open to sky living space. Rooms are almost like storage. You go inside for sleeping, but all of life during the day is lived outside. We see here in this courtyard again, the rooms are surrounding, but the family is gathering and having some interaction in the courtyard. This is from a village in Maharashtra. Those villages were in Jaisalmer, in the desert area, up in the northwest. This is more coastal. You can see the sloped roofs. And this is again a street, a village street. And you can see how people start responding when there's a tree, it creates some shade, people will start sitting. And there are platforms, verandas and little platforms around where the house interacts with the street and the neighborhood. So those were all traditional responses, either urban cities or rural. And we have a third kind of response with a large amount of migrants, especially with the urban, from the rural to urban migration. It leads to creation of what are called sometimes slums, shanty towns, and that's very, very inorganic, very organically grown, not inorganic, pardon me. And here again, development is very intense, and you also see how people use different kinds of materials. Although they don't have much, once they have a patch of land, they have got some asbestos sheets, they collect different materials from everywhere, they use some brick, they use some tarpaulin, and they are creating living spaces for themselves. Yeah, this again is another shanty town. I think this is from Dharavi, which is one of the largest sort of slums in India, or probably they say in Asia. Here is another image that shows how people build for themselves in urban scenarios. What we also note here is how the cables, services, all of these are in this very tangled mess. That happens because people build for themselves and there are no services there. And slowly, when they're resourceful, then they either manage to steal some power, or then they're able to negotiate with government bodies and get some power individually or as a collective. And the services basically start coming in later, if at all. I have here included this image, which is not from India. This is from Brazil. This is the favela. And I just wanted to bring it in to compare that, some of the issues in developing nations have been the same across the world, especially the housing issues. And responses of the human responses to conditions are very similar. Here again, a very bright, colorful favela, but all of it happens very organically. And how people build for themselves and create environments for themselves, and about how resourceful they are. This is back in Dharavi, the largest slum in India, probably Asia. So again, it's looking at how people are conducting their livelihoods and how the street or the open space outside is a very important space. Here we see this potter is doing his work, and the street is also his workshop. It's also his sort of showroom and warehouse. It looks like several other potters are also working in that region, like a guild. Though nobody really created it, that's how people come together. So those are relevant because as we'll see in the work as we go ahead, how these have influenced the architectural responses. So the first housing I'm covering is the Belapur Housing in Navi Mumbai. This was by Charles Correa in 1986. So the Belapur Housing was a proposal for affordable mass housing. And Charles Correa had many ideas and principles which he wanted to implement. So first idea was that housing should be incremental, and you just won't create something and give it to them, because incrementality is important because it allows the house to grow with the family, and the family may not be able to afford the entire house. But as they grow economically, or as their family grows, they may be able to make some addition to it. The other thing that he really talked about is, and in fact, this was a sort of common string and stream in architects of that era, which is looking at housing that is low rise and high density. They say low rise, high density as opposed to multi-story slab blocks, very modernist slab blocks, like Russian housing. So in this project, he demonstrated how high density could be achieved with low-rise courtyard homes, and that it is at a human scale, and they are using very simple materials. As I said, material cost was very expensive, and they used mostly brick or concrete, or even if we could save on RCC, at least when I started my profession as a very young architect at that time. If we could design without RCC in the roof, we would do that using reinforced brick roofs, and that would create a low-cost project. So this project is on about 6 acres of land, and it was located outside of the city, outside of New Mumbai. New Mumbai was a new development to help Mumbai grow, and Korea also believed, and which is a fact, that people needed, even people who are of a very low income category, they need to live close to the city because they're servicing the city. And often land close to the city is expensive, but here they found some land and created this development close to New Mumbai. So it has achieved fairly high density of about 500 persons per hectare, including schools and some community spaces. We can see here this was a typical cluster module that he created. So now here he translated and derived from the patterns of traditional Indian settlements. And what he was doing is he did not create the identical morphology. He picked up the spatial hierarchy and created a very simple modular system which had that sort of richness of scale and hierarchy and something that could fit together. And this spatial hierarchy went on from the private individual dwelling, how it interfaces to the communal court, and then on to a larger public maidan. Which is exactly the sort of pattern that we saw was happening in the traditional towns and in the traditional villages. And Belapur geometry is a direct interpretation of that syntax. Yeah, here you can see from this diagram how it's developed from an individual unit to a cluster of about 7 or 8 houses, and then how several of those combine, 6 or 7 of those little clusters combine to so how 3 of those modules are combined to create a very interesting module that has the courtyards, then again opening into a larger space, and the whole opening moving on outwards towards a larger. Now this shows how 3 of these modules would combine, and you have 1, 2, 3 of these spaces opening onto a larger community space, and then finally several of these would connect to the big public maidan. So here he said that let each house have its own piece of land so that everyone can have open to sky spaces, even if that piece of land is small, and rather than putting them all into a multi-story block. And the open to sky space, as we saw, the outdoor space was important part of living. And so even if somebody had a 1-room or a 2-room house, they could do a lot of their living outside in the open to sky space, adding to the home, so to say. And he also believed in the system of equity. So although the housing caters to a lower income group up to a reasonably middle class or a more wealthy income group for larger families, the actual sites themselves only vary from about 45 square meter to 70 square meters, whereas the houses are supposed to cover the entire social spectrum, including squatter families. And he created very simple forms so that people can easily build on top of it, that they can extend, and those extensions could be done just by masons and by the traditional craftsmen in the area. And he also felt that these would also generate then employment for the local people, rather than a large contractor building the whole thing. So everything was focused on scale and on concern for the human being. So this is really showing how he created some modules, and he also showed through those modules how the housing could be incremental, how people could add to the housing. And in fact, incremental housing is traditionally, housing has been incremental in the third world, probably in a large part of the world, as long as whenever it's done outside of the architect system. And the other advantage of incrementality that was seen was that this would allow houses or housing to be given fairly quickly. You could build something small, and then those properties could be handed over to people. And it would also motivate people to then build and add, because now they had a sense of ownership, and it would inspire them to add to that space. So that's a typical house. Each house, that's a small single, cheapest dwelling that was offered there, just with a WC, an open bath where the person could build a bathroom in the future, a courtyard, just a single room, maybe where place where they could add a kitchen in the future, and then they could build up. And so that is the larger plan of Belapur. We see how spaces are moving into a larger space and then into this Maidan, and it was divided by this sort of canal or nala, a natural drain, into two parts. Here are some photographs. This is the community space with individual homes shared around the courtyard. About 7 houses are around each courtyard. You see the toilet blocks. So the toilet blocks are paired to reduce the service run, again to reduce costs. We see some very simple materials. There's just brick walls. There is some tile roof. Even the sort of door and window frames, that's a small amount of steel being used there for the door frames. Some simple gates. These are the open to sky spaces. Each house has a private open space and this community space. You can see here how easy it would be then to later on make some additions. It's the open to sky space behind the courtyard. We see here some simple materials. These are some steel pipes used as columns. Same steel pipe is used as a railing. Some bamboo mat used for the gate. So that was then, and this is now. This is more recent. I was lucky able to see from some students case study work. I was able to get photographs of what it is more recently. And what has happened is that many of the houses are demolished now. There are bigger, somebody has put concrete houses, some houses have been added to. What also happens is that, you know, as development grows and cities grow, the real estate prices also change. And maybe a different kind of user is using those spaces. But what is significant is that the spatial structure and the hierarchy of community spaces still remains. So there are some patterns that still persist. Here we see the community courtyard with the tree, central tree, the central chalk. Where people could gather and sit. Now you see cars parked there as well. This is still one of the older houses. Here it has been taken over. So here also you can see entirely new structures, very much more, very market concrete houses of 2 or 3 floors have been built. Here we still see, despite the changes, the character of spaces, how the courtyards and streets turn. So there is an intimacy of scale. Yeah, so you see here again, there are few houses that open into this courtyard, very unlike what you may find as mandated in as a brief for housing today. Which a builder or developer wants to do is every house must have its privacy and nobody should be able to even peep into each other, even in the lift lobby. Here all the houses enter through this courtyard, and there is this very nice sort of one-hummy kind of feeling where the dog also sort of, he's enjoying the sun there. People have put out their potted plants. There's a little veranda space. Maybe they can chat in the evening. So it's like community living. That's a very, not an excellent picture, but I unfortunately could not find a nice aerial view. But we do see how the structure of the housing is still somewhat intact, the physical, spatial structure. So next we come to the Asian Games Village housing. This is by Raj Reval, done for the Asian Games 1982. So yeah, completed then, designed a little earlier than that. So Massimo had the opportunity to visit this. He was here in Delhi. We took a walk through. So these are the next couple of housings. This are a little more formal. They are for slightly more upmarket, and they are more urban in their setting. This one, of course, is the most upmarket. Was initially designed as housing for the Commonwealth Games, but the intent was that later on these would be sold to individual owners, and it still is one of, well, I won't say Tony, but part of town, but still a very upmarket housing to be living in. It's a good address to have in Delhi. And this was designed at a density of about 28 units per hectare. So not very dense, but initial development was about 35 acres. And what Reval did here is he studied, looked at the same street and chalk pattern, that morphology, and he had his own translation for it. Here there is not such a diverse income group, but the intent again was to create a low-rise, high-density development. So he had very distinct pedestrian paths, and he also had a separated vehicular movement, as we will see. We move ahead. So this is a older bird's eye view. Now there is a lot of more development around that region. So here we can see how he has attempted to create streets which are opening up into some. There are larger chalks, larger open spaces similar to a Maidan or a chalk, and there is also this very interesting terracing. As we talked about terraces in the traditional development, how the terrace was very important aspect. We see here terraces at different levels. This housing has terraces at different levels. So every house has some kind of a terracing, and the roofscape also has that sense of tradition. While it's a very modernist, it's a standard regular block, but he was able to achieve that sense of blocking, the terracing. Yet in a very much more modern urban sense. You see here some narrow streets. There is a pedestrian priority. We see use of also the traditional jalis, that fenestration on the parapet walls. And we see again larger chalk or larger squares open up. So he created a interesting system, because he was, of course, this was very upmarket, so the automobile and vehicular access was very important. Every house here has a garage, but he separated and segregated the pedestrian and the vehicular movements. So here we see the greens. These are a sort of series of different chalks of slightly different shapes, different forms. So there is no, although they are simple orthogonal, but there is sort of no repetition. There is a lot of variety of spaces of a larger scale, and we can see the darker ones, which are these pedestrian. These spaces are connected through the pedestrian paths. Here we see there's a peripheral road, and how the peripheral roads, each of them goes into a cul-de-sac behind the houses. And these cul-de-sacs have the parking either as parking spaces, car porches attached to the house, or even as individual houses. And when we're looking at this, here you see the gray zone, that is the pedestrian. It's totally segregated from the vehicular and sort of interlacing through the entire development. So you could walk through the entire, through this very, very nice experience through the houses without really coming across any vehicles. And through a sort of, again, through a street court syntax. Yeah. Here we see, this is a pedestrian street. So the streets are consciously broken up. He's used some features. If you remember, I showed you also an image of Datia Fort. If you recall the terraces, the stepping of terraces and sort of gateways there. So he uses that, he uses some terraces, he creates gateways to create a sense of space, to create some vistas, and also to create a sense of enclosure. But these houses are far away enough for good ventilation, lighting. So in that sense, they're driven by very modernist principles. You see the deep overhangs. So a lot of climatic response to shade all the windows, but it's a very modernist response as well. A little inspired from, well, Bouzier's Grey Soleil. So I think we had this image on the first page as well, but we see here now different gateways also are at different scales. You see some things smaller here to the right corner, which is a little entry into this pedestrian space. And as you go through, also get a higher sense of scale. So very masterfully he has used these idioms. And you see lots of terraces at different levels, much like the traditional housing, but very orthogonal, very modernist. You see the deep overhangs, deep shades for the windows to protect from the sun. There is use of jalis so that the terraces can have breeze. This is more view towards the evening, again of a pedestrian vista. The materials again are just local, simple brick, concrete. It's not use of too many materials, even if the jali is just created by brick walls. There's some local stone here, this Delhi quartzite, and the exterior is finished with what we call grit wash. It's just a little concrete with stone chips, and the concrete is washed off. It's an old photograph of one of the narrower streets. These are individual houses. So this is from the vehicular street, and you would sort of walk in. So outside it has this very straight screen facade, and it's broken up in sides where you could be able to walk in. Yeah, I'm afraid I was not able to go there and take photographs, which I would have loved to do. So whatever I could find off of the net, I'm sharing with you. But please feel free to go and search if you like. Yeah, so that is shared housing. And I think one of the very nice responses, and this kind of architecture has influenced a lot of housing in Delhi. This is in Delhi, and in fact, thereafter, the public housing, and I live in one of them, the Delhi Development Authority continued to make housing for people, and these were again walk-up ground, first, second, third, fourth. So four-story apartments built on a very similar terraced kind of format with a similar sort of segregation of the pedestrian movement and the vehicular movement, though not necessarily done as masterfully, but they created very nice housing, large amounts of public housing based on these patterns in Delhi. So this has been very, very influential to a lot of architects. So this is a slightly earlier work. This is Tara Group Housing, again by Charles Correa. Again, these are, this is not as upmarket, but we had something called group housing, meant that a group of people could get together and create a cooperative, and the government would give them land, and they could then appoint an architect, and he would design a housing for them. So the next two housings are group housings. So this would be middle class, maybe, I think this was for some government officers. You can see these concrete beams coming out, pergolas. So Tara Apartments, it is in a upper middle class area of South Delhi, and on this, it's just, it is not like those housings like Belapur. It's about only 160 units, and there were to be 2 and 3 bedroom units. Now in these group housings, what is there is that the Delhi Development Authority had already specified certain densities, certain ground coverage, certain FAR, and those norms had to be met. So now here architects were working within those norms and trying to translate their ideas of what housing should be. So it's not necessary that, say, Korea, who was a great believer in high density, low rise, could not really follow such norms here. He had to design within the bylaws, and bylaw, at that time, bylaw allowed 4 stories without an elevator, without a lift. And if you had to have a lift, then beyond 4 stories, you had to have a lift. Otherwise, you could do walk-up apartments. And so most of these housings and group housings, they preferred to do 4-story housing because lifts were very expensive. So either they built 8 stories, because if you're installing a lift, you go for 8 floors, or you go 4 floors. So, but he, to free up more space on the ground, he did play a little, and he made them into do-play apartments. So he cheated a little on the bylaw, and he made sort of ground for first floor, second, third. And then the third was a duple. So he went up to like ground stories. So here he has used row housing, or what are terrace housing typology, but he very compact and dense, and but he just stacked them up over a number of floors, and he used them. It was a sort of rectilinear site, so he has used these in a staggering form, and again created a sort of internal street or internal community space, which he then used to create a very sort of cool microclimate, and it was very densely landscaped. We see here in the section, I apologize, it's a very pixelated one, but I could not source a good section, but it gives the idea. So he tried to translate the street typology, creating a central, very shaded space with deep shadows, which would remain cool. He also used the housing units were all cantilever and projecting onto this space, to shade it further. So they were, and by also staggering them into the space, we see here he is able to create terraces on the outside. So he used the housing block itself to create these huge overhangs. In addition, he also used big pergolas, sort of concrete beams coming out and connecting bridges, which would then have a lot of plantation and foliage. So all of that would allow some light in, but it would filter it and keep this central space very cool. And the plants would also act as a kind of humidification zone. There will be some evaporation and also that evaporative cooling effect. And the external parts terraces could be used for outdoor seating, outdoor activity. So this was a feature. Definitely every house at that time in housing, we tried to give every house a terrace. And what he also did is that this central space is somewhat raised. It's at a platform and it's totally pedestrian, and the vehicular cars were towards the down in the basement and out on the two sides. So here's an axonometric that explains how he did this. So very, very linear homes with a central staircase, and these were duplets going crisscross, overlapping each other. You can see from the lower unit, if you walked in, there is a terrace, a living space, dining, and the staircase, and then the kitchen is behind. And you would walk up, and you had 2 bedrooms with the toilet core in the middle. And again, a terrace up above. So terraces at the 2 levels. And you see that big on the left of the pergola, concrete beams with then some trellis work for the plantation. And some of these terraces also could be overlooking each other for some community interaction. So, yeah, so each space has this very important open to sky space that Korea talks about of 10 square meters, although it's stacked up. It's 5 floors. And he has talked about it being important for sleeping out. And the fact is that a lot of us Indians, till recently, we did that. Maybe at least till I was in, yeah, till the 90s, you could still go out and sleep out on the terrace in the summer, where it got really cool in the evening. Not everybody did not have air conditioners, so that was an option to sleep under the stars. Unfortunately, now with the pollution and yeah, we can't do that. It does not even get so cool anymore. That's a section showing how he segregated the traffic, created entirely pedestrianized housing zones safe for children. Here are some photographs. You can see how at subsequent floors, the entire mass, the entire unit is coming out, creating a very, very shaded, deep shadows at the ground level. Here again, the material was concrete and exposed brick. You can see the deep shadows, the bridges, the staircases and the connecting bridges. So very strong sense of play of light and shade. Some more recent photograph, unfortunately, the brick has been painted over by red paint, but you can still see the basic architecture of it. You also see how the staircase comes up around this vertical concrete wall, sheer wall, and we have the stair, and then the same stair goes up to 2 different apartments. This has a funny yellow cast, but you can definitely see the quality of spaces and this very, very modernist feel. While it's a strong climatic response, here's a larger community space, stilted space, opening onto an open sort of amphitheater. Yeah, you see the staircases. Okay, so just a word about this Tara housing. Architects loved it and have loved the open space, the internal space. But I do have to say that residents were not necessarily very happy about living in this very linear kind of uh, home. And I say this because as students, we did case studies of Tara, and the next housing I will show you, Yamuna Apartments, in our early first year or second year. And I think Indians with large families like to live a little more spread out rather than this sort of duple where they are separated from each other. So this is very close to Tara Apartments in the similar area. Again, the profile of user will be similar. Probably they were a group of government employees, but these were all people from southern India living in Delhi, in northern India. So people from southern India have, some other kind of typical need, and this housing tried to sensitively address their needs. So this is for about 200 people, and this was on 3.75 acres of land. This is designed by a design group that was, initially there were three architects, Ajoy Chaudhary, Ranjit Sabiki, and Murad Chaudhary, but mostly it was Ranjit Sabiki and Ajoy Chaudhary who designed this. So it's a very modernist building, a lot of blocking. But again, there is some idiom that they have tried to pick from the traditional sort of street pattern, so to say. And so what they say is that the concept is developed from a typical Indian village, and the pedestrian street becomes an extension of the house. And these pedestrian streets, as we can see in the site plan, we have several of these narrow streets. Again, they used a staggered block, to create that, somewhat to replicate the sense that you would get in organic street development. And opening onto a larger square, you could walk through these streets, come into a larger and come into these public spaces. So a larger plaza and these public spaces. Here is a view of entry into that street area. So here's an external view of the facade. Here you can see he has just used blocking, a very, very staggered blocking. Again, a lot of focus is there on the terraces, and in fact in this housing there is two layers of terraces, an open to sky part and a covered part, and each house has a terrace, open to sky and a protected covered one. Okay. So these are the plans. Planning was done with very specific requirements of that particular community. All the kitchens were accessed separately from outside of the house. While there was a common staircase, but near the house it bifurcated so that each house could have a privacy. They did not want to directly open into each other's homes. And here we see the layout is not a duplex, it's just on a single floor with a very simple pattern. There are 2-bedroom and 3-bedroom units. But here at the back, we can see the 2 layers of terraces, open to sky, covered, open to sky and covered. And you can see the terrace below, the staggering of terraces. This is an old picture showing that same view entering into the street. I think, in fact, this is, and you can see these little two-wheeler scooters. They were very popular in India at one time as the go-to mode of transport. So the pedestrian zone was envisaged as a place for children to play. Here are some more photographs. This is the sort of larger public space where it opens in, the larger chalk. Here we see the terraces used for drying clothes. People would even sleep out. It's a more recent image, and you can see it's still being used like that. People are sitting out in part of their covered open space, or that veranda which will open into their open to sky space. So the materials here again are just concrete, brick, and what was very popular at that time is stone washed grit. So they had exterior finish was washed grit and doesn't need any painting, so no maintenance finish. So the last one I cover is Aranya Housing in Indore. And this is designed by Balakrishna Doshi. And 1982, Doshi is the Indian architect who got the Pritzker in 2018. And Doshi initially, although he studied at JJ College in Mumbai, but then he went abroad and he worked under Corbusier. He was also involved working with Corbusier when Chandigarh was being made. He did some projects in Ahmedabad, handled projects for Corbusier. And then he started his practice in the 50s. Doshi was, over time, he got very concerned about India and the Indian condition, and he got very interested in what is special about human settlements in India. And he set up in 1976 the Vastushilp Foundation, which was dedicated for, to study and document human settlements. And especially there was a lot of informal housing, or informal housing is what we call, squatter resettlements or other forms. There were unauthorized colonies. People would just buy plots. They were not developed by government, and they would just build something on their own without architects. So he was very focused on studying that. And while some architects were quite focused on materials and low-cost technologies, Doshi's interest was to analyze social structures and everyday habits of people. How does that habit generate, how does that usage pattern generate a space? And by looking at these, of how traditionally people live, what are the vernacular traditions, what are the residential structures built by these, he called them anonymous architects. So he tried to look beyond aesthetic considerations. In fact, we see the sketch, the drawing above. This is of his conceptualization of Aranya. And in fact, he felt that, yes, people are very resourceful, they're very rich, there can be very rich responses to design and architecture in people's own way. They have their own aesthetic, and let them, if we let them do their own thing, and we must appreciate that aesthetic. So this sort of elevational sketch represents that, how people create a very, very rich architecture for themselves, with color, with texture, with decoration. And it's because of his foundation's work that, though she also understood what was very important in housing was durable infrastructure systems. That's roads, to stormwater drainage, to sewerage, and electricity. And now I do take you back to the, if you recall the image we saw with the big, all those electrical lines going across in this informal housing. Those are exactly the issues he felt need to be addressed in a housing for the poor. Because people could make their own, build their own homes, but what is missing in all of those places, those shanty towns, is the structure, is the services, which often came after the construction was made. So Aranya is a project which really looked at that. There have been several other, and these were called, these were housing as sites and services, which means that you would give people the plot of land, and you would also give them the basic services, so the toilets, so that the hygiene, health, the sewage is taken care of. And then people are resourceful enough to build, and they could build their own structures within this framework. So by the time Doshi began to work on this Aranya master plan, already the government's investment in housing was declining. Government didn't have much money, and they were looking at what alternatives can be there to house the poor. And one of the big issue was how to provide housing for the urban slum dwellers, who all migrated from rural areas in search of livelihood. And standardized housing plans were not the solution. The people didn't live like that, to put them in one slab block, in 1 or 2 room tenement projects. Such projects had been also destroyed in other places in the world. So Doshi, he resisted from proliferating these sort of repetitive multi-story blocks. And Aranya was aimed at EWS. In India, EWS is economically weaker section residents. That's a polite sort of nomenclature for the poor and the have-nots. And the smallest plot of land in Aranya are just 35 square meters. And a basic plinth was provided with a service core, like space for a WC and a tap, water tap, a bath. And they had the option of one built room, maybe like a kitchen, but they were connected to water and electricity. And also in Aranya, the master plan, again, with this whole principle of mixing of people and the notion of equity, the master plan also contained households of middle and higher income groups. So on the left here, you see, this is a very famous sketch by Doshi. And here we can see how he is seeing how the house evolves and how somebody builds their own home. There is a cloth and a canvas and some mud walls. Even the charpoy or the cot on which people sleep outdoors, even that is a space. The outdoors is a space. And slowly people add to it. Initially, they will cover their living space with a cloth or canvas. Then they put in a pakka or a sort of more permanent roof, maybe with stones or brick or concrete. And slowly they continue to add, then they add another room, they add a staircase, they add a terrace as the family expands and their economic wherewithal expands. So Doshi did not think of the house as one fixed inert entity, and he says, even if it is made of bricks, housing cannot be thought of as permanent, argues Doshi. And the most important thing is to think about the project over time. Housing is not inert, it is a living entity. And Aranya sits in a diametrically opposing space from the absolutism of Corbusian planning ideas. It is a high density and low rise work in constant progress. So this I've quoted, this is from Architectural Review. If anybody would like to read that article, it's a very interesting article. I will share at the end of the talk. So the next series of slides are just showing how the house would evolve. This is the basic site. We see here the plinths are created. Some walls have been provided. And the service core, the WC, and some open space for a bath, they're provided. And very thoughtfully, there is a cow also sketched there. So next, probably the toilet block could get permanent, be built up, and a room could have been built, covered. Then they begin to add something on top of their room at the roof level, a little fabric canopy as life goes on outside. This camel cart going by. And then eventually they could make the room on top as well, a sort of more permanent room rather than a fabric roof. And they also begin to develop a little area outside of the house towards the street, make some platforms, some planting so that they can begin to sit out, interact with the community. Yeah. And so on. How the house will evolve and grow as they add room by room and floor by floor. And they continue to use their outdoor spaces, using the terrace, using that interface with the street. So that was how she had visualized Aranya. And this is the entire master plan, which was covering a huge area of 85 hectares. And this entire 85 hectares was designed. I don't think all of it was eventually built, but the infrastructure was designed by engineer Himanshu Parekh, who was a very important part of the team. And they used the natural side slopes, and a total of 6,500 plots were delineated on the master plan. And it created a combination of these smaller incremental housing, the smaller plots and the central cores, and on the exteriors, we see the larger plots. You can see the interior cores, the smaller plots, they're shaded. And the lighter ones, slightly larger. Sites on the surrounding. And then there are community play fields, etc. Here's part of a tracing from which is showing how these small units were designed and how that neighborhood was designed. So this is a neighborhood level plan. We see the main streets. So the streets are running on either side. If we come in, we see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There are these 5 houses around this court, and then 6, 7, 8, 9. So about 9 of them sort of are able in this plan to share their services. So services also, a lot of cost goes into services on such a development. So the services were designed very, very tight to really save on cost. And this whole pattern of development is very focused on that, and yet creating that hierarchy of spaces, creating that community court and a street. So still creating on the upper side, still creating a street pattern, some courtyards. So creating still a variety of spaces. So keeping in line with the idea of just providing sites and services, in the Aranya housing, only initially just a sample of about 80 model homes were made. And these were from different sizes with a different variety of options, slightly bigger and smaller. And the idea was that, once these are built, this will initiate development. They will act as guidelines to people how to build their own homes. And needless to say, again, it would generate a mass of activity and lots of smaller level contractors, smaller level of masons could all be employed, and there could also be a lot of enterprise. The basic structure again is load bearing on a concrete plinth. And this was just demonstrating how people could build within this different kind of typologies. And what he also did is he created a certain kit of different elements and features, different kind of jalis, railings, patterns, certain kind of doors. So doors and windows could just be fabricated on site. And this was his idea, that seeing these, people would use similar elements to create the vocabulary, or based on this, they would develop their own and add that texture and variety to the houses that they built. This is a picture of part of Aranya in the 90s. And Himanshu Parekh, who was the engineer at that time, he has commented that after seeing this, that the question, he says, visiting Aranya in the early 90s made Himanshu Parekh question the conventional perception of poverty and realize that the so-called poor have huge potential resources. Yeah. So what are those resources? The resource is enterprise. That resource is their own sense of aesthetic, of resourcefulness, of managing, of making something and creating something. And I think that was the really important underlying theme of Aranya. And here we see how it is being used, how life is extending into the open spaces, into the alleyways. People are using the terraces, clothes are drying, people sit outside for some chit chat. It's a little, yeah, that's like a taxi cab parked there. It rides. There's some machine or equipment. Somebody is running on the terrace. People have planted some plantain, banana trees there. So we see a lady with some small children sunning themselves. So again, that richness of character has come, and also I think a sort of that sense of comfort that people have with the space and the sense of ownership. Uh, Photographs during the construction phase of that early phase when the 80 units were being built. Here is a later picture of Aranya. You see the site, the street life. You see how different people have adapted their little low fronts. The different kinds of jalis are being used. And also there are some alleyways. So there is the street and then there are the narrower alleyways which have some intimate scale of spaces. And from this street we will go into a larger communal space. So that pattern again persists. So how people use their own space differently. Somebody parks a cycle, another one has grown some plants. Similar elements, slightly different designs and responses, different ways of decoration, color, which adds that richness to the community. Here's another street view showing all the little different adaptations, modifications that people do as they continue to use the space. So now today, no one really knows where Aranya is because that was just 80 houses and it was such a large, such a massive development. And though she had talked of changes to the staircases, the terraces and the colors, and the reality is that most of even those original 80 houses have been demolished and something new has come up. And only some small number of those original houses remain. And the neighborhood has grown organically all around and it has been absorbed by the city of Indore. But I think that is how, though she would have envisaged growth and change, he was not someone to say that he would hold on to his architecture. In fact, he felt that once the architect has done and designed and then it is handed over to the owner and then the owner is the architect. And it no longer belongs to the architect. So I don't think he would have any regrets that so much change and development has happened. Yeah, so this is, I also tried to search for Aranya and this is the bird's eye I could get, and for the life of me, I cannot locate those original houses within this. So that's how the city has grown and engulfed that housing. But we do see that the built form and the hierarchy of spaces is still continuing somewhere. We see those patterns. And yeah, what I also want to, I have just come back to this image because what I did also want to people to really notice that although this has that little sense of individual level of development, people doing and adding something of their own, but as we can see compared to the images we saw earlier of just totally organic development where services were added later or missing. Here it's a little more orderly, it's more organized, and that's because the site was already serviced. The services were provided before, and then people were given the freedom to build as they wanted, as opposed to people building and then the services trying to come into that. So that was Aranya, I think, one of Doshi's, I think it expresses what Doshi really stands for, although of course he has done many institutional and many other kind of projects, but this was seminal in a way that it influenced people, it influenced other architects, students, everybody was very inspired, and a lot of learning happened from that generation of us. So then in the 80s, India liberalized its economy and we became more global. We opened up to global foreign investments, and public projects per se started to dry up, and especially with regard to housing. Government policy by and large has moved housing into the private sector. So, individual developers would develop the land instead of government and housing boards, which was what was happening in the 70s and 80s. And projects now were commissioned by private clients who were essentially developers, and most of them were seeking to imitate what was being done elsewhere. And discussions about housing were reduced to very universal and quantifiable criteria to determine, to the detriment of design principles. As Scriver and Bhatt said, we don't talk about families, we talk about rooms. And it really has been reduced, housing today, to at least the discourse in housing. A lot is on numbers and on plans, and more driven by developers marketing brochures, and the conversations focus more around the maximum number of saleable units and on ROI. Not to say that people don't address or at least make an attempt to address the environment, but the conversations and the primary concerns are different and shifted from that era of idealism, which was, I think, end of an era. So these are the architects whose work we looked at today. There's Balkrishna Doshi, Charles Correa, Ajoy Chaudhary, Ranjit Siddiqui, and Raj Rewal. Some of them are not here anymore, but they have left behind, I think, a big legacy, because they trained a lot of us, and they left a lot of food for thought. So I also am thankful for the so many articles and from which I could, and books I could source this information, especially since it is a lockdown. I was totally dependent on the internet for images, so I have even taken images from sometimes from some student works. And but especially I would like to highlight the book by Vikram Bhatt and Peter Scriver, which is After the Masters, Contemporary Indian Architecture. Then there is a article, a study of living culture and typomorphology of vernacular traditional houses in Kerala. I got some images from there. I think an important article people may enjoy reading is the architectural review, Belapur Housing in Navi Mumbai by Charles Correa. The article is by Peter Davey. Another interesting article, especially those who are interested in critical regionalism, I think their study covers a lot of that, is a study of regional assertions in the architecture of Delhi from 1970s to the present. This is by Sanyam Baga and Gaurav Raheja. Then in the RIBA journal, there is, and I'm grateful to Charles Correa Foundation. I got a lot of material from the architects' websites as well, and some images from Sangat, that is Doshi's office, and from the Vastuship Foundation. Another interesting article people may like to read is Structured Perceptions by Gautam Bhatia. It's in online, it's in something called Muharto. And another important book which will cover some of this and a lot more, hell of a lot more, on the entire gamut of Indian architecture is Modern Architectures in History, India, again by Peter Scriver and Amit Srivastava. And then there are a lot of other sources, including Wikipedia, from where I sourced images. So I'm grateful to all of these sources to be available. Thank you.